He thought he was removing a problem from his premium cabin, but had no idea he was about to delay an entire flight with one careless sentence. The soft amber lights of the business class cabin reflected off polished armrests and tailored suits as passengers settled into their wide leather seats. The quiet hum of the aircraft's systems blending with muted conversations about meetings, investments, and destinations hundreds of miles away. And right in the middle of that carefully curated world of status and expectation stood Evelyn Carter, her presence almost invisible at first glance, dressed in a simple gray sweater and dark slacks. Her worn leather tote resting gently against her leg as if it had seen more years than most of the luggage stacked neatly in overhead bins. Her movements calm, deliberate, unbothered by the subtle glances that flickered her way, glances that measured her, categorized her, and quietly dismissed her before she even reached her seat. Daniel Brooks, the airline's senior cabin manager for this flight, noticed her immediately, not because she caused a disturbance, but because she didn't fit the picture he believed this space was reserved for, his eyes scanning her from head to toe with the precision of someone who had built a career on maintaining standards, or at least what he believed standards should look like. And as he adjusted the cuff of his crisp navy uniform, he stepped forward with a smile that never quite reached. His eyes, the kind of smile polished for compliance rather than kindness. "Ma'am," he said smoothly, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of nearby passengers. Economy class is located toward the back of the aircraft. And for a brief moment, time seemed to slow as a few passengers exchanged knowing looks, a faint ripple of restrained laughter passing through the cabin like a quiet wave, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to be felt. Evelyn paused, her hand resting lightly on the top of seat 3A, her ticket already scanned, her place already assigned, yet her presence somehow still on trial, and she turned her gaze toward Daniel, her eyes steady, unreadable, not defensive, not embarrassed, just calm in a way that didn't match the situation unfolding around her. And in that silence, something shifted, something almost imperceptible, as if the room itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel, misreading her composure as confusion, took another step closer, lowering his voice slightly, but not enough to hide the condescension woven into his tone. "This section is reserved for premium passengers," he added, gesturing casually toward the aisle behind her, reinforcing his earlier point as if repeating it would somehow make it more valid. And a man seated across the aisle smirked faintly while adjusting his designer watch, his amusement quiet but visible, while a woman too rose. A head glanced back just long enough to witness the exchange before quickly looking away, unwilling to be part of it, but unwilling to intervene. Evelyn didn't move, didn't argue, didn't explain, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag before relaxing again, her posture unchanged, grounded, as though she had stood in moments like this before and knew something the rest of the cabin didn't, something Daniel certainly didn't. And as the overhead bins clicked shut one by one and the final passengers boarded, the tension lingered in the air, thin but sharp, like the quiet before a storm no one yet recognized, because in that moment, to everyone watching, it looked like a simple misunderstanding, a minor inconvenience in an otherwise routine boarding process. But what none of them realized, what Daniel failed to see entirely, was that the woman he was so eager to redirect had just stepped into a role far more significant than any seat assignment could suggest. And with one more decision, one more word, he was about to turn a forgettable interaction into something the entire flight would never forget. The faint laughter did not last long, but the damage had already settled into the air like a quiet stain that refused to disappear, and Daniel Brooks, sensing the attention he had drawn, straightened his posture as if doubling down on authority would somehow validate his judgment, his polished shoes planted firmly against the carpeted aisle while his gaze remained fixed on Evelyn Carter with a certainty that bordered on impatience. "I will need to see your boarding pass again," he said, this time louder, more formal, making it clear to everyone within earshot that this was no longer a suggestion but a directive, and a few passengers nearby leaned subtly forward, their curiosity sharpening as the moment stretched, because nothing draws attention faster than the possibility of someone being out of place in a room designed to reward belonging. Evelyn reached into her tote without haste, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if time itself had slowed around her. And when she handed him the boarding pass, her expression remained unchanged, calm in a way that felt almost out of sync with the tension building around her, while Daniel took the document between his fingers with a quick glance, scanning it as though expecting to find a mistake that would confirm his assumption, his brow tightening ever so slightly when the printed seat number matched exactly where she stood. But instead of stepping back, instead of acknowledging the quiet correction in front of him, he hesitated, his pride catching up to his logic, and that hesitation was enough to push the moment further than it needed to go. "There must be some kind of error in the system," he said, not to Evelyn but to the surrounding space, as if speaking it aloud would make it true, and the subtle shift in tone turned a resolved situation into an unresolved accusation, causing a low murmur to ripple through the cabin. Because now it was no longer about a simple direction, it was about doubt, about whether this woman truly belonged here despite the evidence in his hand. A flight attendant standing a few feet away exchanged a quick glance with another crew member, uncertainty flickering across her face, but she said nothing, bound by the invisible hierarchy that kept her silent, while Daniel continued, his voice now carrying a faint edge. "Ma'am, please step aside while we verify this." And the word verify lingered longer than necessary, heavy with implication, suggesting that her presence required confirmation in a way others did not. Evelyn did not argue, did not defend herself. She simply stepped half a pace to the side, her eyes scanning the cabin for just a brief second, not in search of help, but in quiet observation, as though taking note of every face, every reaction, every person who chose to watch rather than speak. And in that brief pause, something deeper began to settle beneath the surface, something patient, controlled, waiting. A man seated near the window cleared his throat softly, shifting in his seat as if uncomfortable with the unfolding scene, while another passenger adjusted her scarf and avoided eye contact entirely, the social choreography of silence playing out exactly as it often does when discomfort meets convenience. Daniel turned toward his tablet, tapping rapidly, his movements sharper now, driven less by procedure and more by the need to justify himself. And for a moment, the only sounds were the soft chime of the aircraft systems and the faint rustle of fabric as people pretended not to listen. But everyone was listening, because moments like this had a way of pulling attention no matter how discreet they appeared. Evelyn stood there without resistance, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, her silence no longer passive but intentional. And though Daniel could not see it, though no one in that cabin could fully recognize it yet, the balance of the situation had already begun to shift, not through force, not through argument, but through something far more unsettling. The quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly when to speak and exactly when to wait. And as Daniel continued tapping at his screen, searching for validation that refused to appear, the space between them grew heavier, tighter, until even the faintest whisper felt too loud. And somewhere in that growing silence, the first hint of doubt began to creep into the very man who had been so certain just moments before. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the cabin like a thin sheet of glass that no one dared to crack, and Daniel Brooks felt it before he fully understood it. The subtle shift in energy that happens when certainty begins to slip, yet instead of stepping back, instead of correcting course, he leaned further into the role he believed he needed to play, his jaw tightening as he turned slightly toward the nearest flight attendant. "Hold boarding for a moment," he instructed, his voice controlled, but carrying enough weight to halt the final passengers from entering. And just like that, what had been a minor delay became something else entirely, something larger, something visible. A faint chime echoed overhead as the boarding process paused, and several passengers exchanged glances, their patience thinning as minutes began to matter. Because in an environment where schedules are precise and every second is accounted for, any delay becomes significant, and now all of it seemed to revolve around one woman standing quietly beside seat 3A. Evelyn Carter did not react to the announcement, did not shift her stance or adjust her expression. She simply remained where she was, her presence steady, grounded, as if the growing inconvenience around her had nothing to do with her at all. And that composure, that refusal to engage on the level Daniel expected, made the situation feel even more unbalanced. Daniel glanced down at his tablet again, scrolling through the passenger manifest with increasing intensity, searching for something that would justify his actions, something that would confirm that his instinct had been right from the beginning. But the information refused to cooperate, every detail aligning perfectly with Evelyn's boarding pass, every system confirming what he was unwilling to accept. And yet the longer he stood there, the harder it became for him to step back without losing face. A man seated across the aisle shifted forward slightly, his voice low but clear enough to be heard. "If her seat is valid, maybe we should just get going," he said, not confrontational, just practical. And for a brief moment, it seemed like the tension might dissolve, like the situation might quietly correct itself. But Daniel did not acknowledge him, did not even turn his head, because doing so would mean allowing someone else to influence the outcome, and that was something he was not prepared to do. Instead, he exhaled slowly and looked back at Evelyn, his tone sharpening just enough to carry authority without raising his voice. "Until this is resolved, I cannot allow you to take this seat," he said, and the word "cannot" landed with finality, drawing a clear line where there did not need to be one. And a faint murmur spread through the cabin again, this time less amused, more uneasy. Evelyn's eyes met his for a brief second, steady and unwavering. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that Daniel did not fully register but felt nonetheless, a quiet confidence that did not belong to someone uncertain of her place. And yet she still did not argue, did not raise her voice, did not attempt to prove anything. She simply reached into her tote once more, her movements calm, almost routine, as if she had already decided how this would unfold long before anyone else realized it was even a situation. The soft click of a phone being unlocked broke through the silence, subtle but distinct, and for the first time since the exchange began, a few heads turned not toward Daniel, but toward Evelyn, curiosity shifting direction as the balance of attention began to move, slowly, almost imperceptibly, away from the man in uniform and toward the woman he had tried so hard to dismiss. And though no one could yet see what she was doing, though no one could hear the words she was about to speak, the air itself seemed to tighten in anticipation, as if the cabin, the crew, and every passenger on board could feel that whatever came next would not be small, would not be quiet, and would not leave things the way they were. The faint glow of the phone screen reflected briefly in Evelyn Carter's steady eyes as she lifted it to her ear, the motion so calm, so unhurried, that it contrasted sharply with the tightening tension surrounding her. And for a moment, no one spoke, as if the entire cabin had instinctively leaned into the pause, waiting without realizing they were waiting. While Daniel Brooks watched with a flicker of irritation that he quickly masked behind a professional expression, his posture still rigid, his authority still asserted, yet something about the situation was beginning to slip beyond his control in a way he could not quite define. Evelyn did not raise her voice when the call connected. She spoke softly, clearly, her tone measured and precise. "Yes, I am on flight 728, she said, her words simple, almost ordinary, yet carrying a quiet weight that did not match the simplicity of the sentence. And though the person on the other end could not be heard, the shift in her demeanor suggested recognition, not urgency, not panic, just recognition, as if she had reached exactly who she intended to reach. A few passengers exchanged subtle glances, curiosity now replacing earlier amusement, because something about the way she spoke did not align with the role she had been assigned in their minds just moments before, and even the flight attendants, who had remained respectfully distant, began to watch more closely, their training telling them to stay neutral, but their instincts pulling their attention toward the unfolding moment. Daniel crossed his arms lightly, an attempt to reassert composure, though the gesture carried a hint of impatience. "Ma'am, if you need assistance, I can have someone help you after we resolve this," he said. The words polite on the surface but edged with an underlying insistence that the situation remain under his control, yet Evelyn did not respond to him. Not immediately, her attention still on the call, her presence grounded in a way that made his interruption feel almost misplaced. "We are currently delayed at the gate," she continued into the phone, her voice steady. "Yes, boarding has been paused." And that detail, spoken so plainly, landed differently than anything else had so far, because now the delay was no longer just a minor inconvenience. It was something acknowledged, something documented beyond the confines of the cabin, and Daniel felt it. A subtle tightening in his chest as the reality of the situation began to extend beyond his immediate authority. The man seated near the aisle shifted again, this time more noticeably, his earlier discomfort evolving into something closer to concern, while a woman a few rows back leaned slightly forward, no longer pretending not to listen, because whatever this was, it was no longer ordinary. Evelyn paused briefly, listening, her expression unchanged, then nodded once. Even though the person on the other end could not see her, understood, she said quietly, and with that single word, the atmosphere shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably, like the first drop of rain before a storm becomes visible. Daniel uncrossed his arms, his gaze narrowing just slightly, not in anger but in uncertainty, because for the first time since the exchange began, he no longer knew exactly what he was responding to, and that loss of clarity unsettled him more than he would have admitted. Evelyn lowered the phone just enough to end the call, her fingers moving with the same calm precision they had shown from the beginning. And then she looked at Daniel, not with defiance, not with frustration, but with a quiet steadiness that carried something deeper, something final. And in that look was a message that did not need to be spoken, a message that said the moment had already moved beyond him. The overhead lights hummed softly as the cabin remained suspended in silence. Every passenger now fully aware that something significant was unfolding, even if they did not yet understand what it was. And somewhere beyond the aircraft door, unseen but approaching, the first pieces of a response had already been set in motion, moving closer with each passing second. While inside the cabin, Daniel Brooks stood exactly where he had placed himself, at the center of a situation he had created, unaware that in just moments, the role he had so confidently played would no longer belong to him at all. The silence inside the cabin did not break with noise, it broke with movement, subtle at first, almost easy to miss, as the aircraft door at the front of the cabin opened once more with a quiet mechanical click, and a ripple of attention shifted instantly toward it, because by now every passenger had felt it, that something was about to change, something that would explain the tension hanging in the air, and the moment stretched just long enough for anticipation to take hold before too sharply. Dressed individuals stepped onto the aircraft, their presence immediately distinct from the usual boarding flow, their posture composed, their expressions focused, scanning the cabin not with curiosity, but with purpose. Daniel Brooks noticed them almost instantly, his body turning slightly, his confidence returning in a reflexive way, as though reinforcements had arrived to validate his actions. Yet something about their demeanor did not match what he expected, because they did not look to him first, they did not pause for instruction. Instead, their attention moved past him, directly toward the woman standing beside seat 3A. Evelyn Carter did not move to meet them. She did not step forward or raise her hand. She simply remained where she was, her calm presence unchanged, as if she had known exactly how this moment would unfold. And when one of the individuals spoke, his voice carried clearly through the quiet cabin, not loud, but unmistakably respectful. "Miss Carter," he said, with a slight nod, the kind reserved for someone of importance rather than someone being questioned, and in that instant, the entire dynamic shifted, not gradually, but completely. The faint murmur that followed was no longer amused, no longer uncertain. It was recognition dawning too late, spreading through the passengers as they began to understand that what they had witnessed was not a misunderstanding, but a misjudgment. Daniel's posture stiffened, the confidence he had held just moments before faltering in a way he could not fully control, because the tone, the address, the respect in that simple greeting did not align with the assumptions he had built the entire situation on. And for a brief second, he did not speak, he did not move. He simply stood there, caught between what he thought he knew and what was now unfolding in front of him. The second individual stepped slightly forward, his attention still fixed on Evelyn. "We received your call," he added, his voice measured, professional, but carrying a weight that extended far beyond routine procedure. And that single sentence made it clear to everyone listening that this was no ordinary escalation. This was not a customer complaint or a minor issue being resolved. This was something higher, something connected to levels of authority that did not usually enter a boarding gate unannounced. Evelyn inclined her head just slightly in acknowledgement, her expression still composed, her voice calm as she finally spoke again. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, and the simplicity of her tone contrasted sharply with the magnitude of the response it had triggered. A flight attendant near the galley shifted her stance, her earlier uncertainty replaced with a quiet alertness, while the man seated by the aisle who had spoken earlier now leaned back slowly, his expression no longer questioning, but contemplative, as if replaying the moment in his mind and seeing it differently now. Daniel finally found his voice, though it came out more controlled than confident. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," he began, the words carefully chosen, an attempt to regain control of the narrative. But even as he spoke them, it was clear that the narrative had already moved beyond him, because the two individuals did not turn toward him, did not acknowledge his explanation. Their focus remained entirely on Evelyn Carter, as if she were the only person in the situation whose perspective mattered. And in that moment, with the cabin still, the air heavy, and every eye watching, the truth that had been hidden beneath assumptions and appearances finally began to surface, not through confrontation, not through raised voices, but through recognition, through the quiet, undeniable shift in how one woman was being addressed and how one man was no longer being heard. Daniel Brooks felt it fully now, the quiet collapse of certainty that does not happen all at once but unfolds in layers, each second stripping away the confidence he had stood on just moments before. And as the two senior officials remained focused entirely on Evelyn Carter, the space he once controlled no longer belonged to him, not in authority, not in attention, not even in presence, because the room had already shifted, and it had shifted away from him. The man who had first spoken to Evelyn straightened slightly, his tone respectful, but now carrying a formal clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. "We apologize for the delay, Miss Carter," he said. And even that simple sentence carried weight, because apologies at that level were not given lightly, especially not in front of an entire cabin of paying passengers. And as the words settled into the air, a subtle realization spread through those watching, that this was not just about one woman being inconvenienced. This was about someone whose experience mattered at a level most of them would never fully see. Evelyn inclined her head again, her composure unchanged, her voice calm as she responded, "Thank you." And then, after the briefest pause, she added, "I would like the boarding process to continue." And that was all. No anger, no raised voice, no demand for punishment, just a simple request that carried more authority than anything Daniel had said since the moment this began. The second official nodded immediately, turning slightly toward the crew with quiet efficiency. "Resume boarding," he instructed, and the command was followed without hesitation, as if the entire system had been waiting for that exact signal. And just like that, movement returned to the cabin, the line at the door shifting forward, the flow of passengers restarting, but the atmosphere was no longer the same. It had changed in a way that could not be undone. Daniel remained where he was, his posture rigid, his expression carefully controlled, but the silence around him felt different now, no longer neutral, no longer observant. It was aware, and that awareness pressed against him in a way that words could not. The first official finally turned his attention toward Daniel, not abruptly, not aggressively, but with a measured calm that somehow carried more weight than confrontation ever could. "We will review this situation after departure," he said, his tone even, professional, but final, and Daniel nodded almost automatically, the gesture small, restrained, yet revealing in its lack of resistance. Because for the first time since the interaction began, he was no longer leading the situation, he was responding to it. Evelyn stepped into her seat without further comment, placing her bag gently beside her, her movements as composed as they had been from the beginning. And as she settled in, a quiet stillness followed her, not imposed, not forced, but naturally formed, as if the space itself recognized the shift that had taken place. A passenger across the aisle lowered his gaze, the earlier smirk long gone, replaced by something closer to reflection, while a woman near the window adjusted her posture, her attention lingering just a second longer before turning away, each small reaction adding to the silent acknowledgement that something meaningful had occurred. The aircraft door closed once more with a firm, final sound, and as the cabin prepared for departure, the hum of the engines slowly rising, the moment did not fade. It settled, embedding itself into the memory of everyone present, not because of what was said, but because of what was revealed. And as Daniel Brooks stood quietly in the aisle, no longer the center of attention, no longer the voice of authority, he finally understood something that could not be undone, that respect, once withheld, in arrogance, does not return on command, and sometimes the quietest response carries the loudest consequence. The aircraft began its slow pushback from the gate, the subtle shift in motion barely noticeable at first. Yet inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained far from ordinary, as if the event that had just unfolded still lingered between the rows of seats, woven into the quiet hum of the engines and the low murmur of passengers settling back into their routines, though nothing truly felt routine anymore. Evelyn Carter sat composed in seat 3A, her posture relaxed, her gaze directed forward, not seeking attention, not acknowledging the glances that still found their way toward her, because she did not need to. The moment had already spoken for itself, and in that silence, her presence carried more weight than any explanation ever could. Daniel Brooks moved down the aisle with measured steps, performing his duties with the same precision he always had. Yet something in his demeanor had shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The confidence that once guided his actions now replaced by a careful awareness, as though every movement, every word, was being weighed against what had just occurred. A flight attendant approached him quietly near the galley, her voice low, respectful. "Is everything all right?" she asked, not out of concern for the process, but for the tension that had not yet fully dissipated, and Daniel paused for a fraction of a second before responding. "Everything is under control," he said, though the words sounded different now, less like a declaration and more like a reassurance he was trying to convince himself of. As the plane continued to taxi, a few passengers exchanged hushed comments, their earlier detachment replaced by reflection, because what they had witnessed was not just a delay, not just an interaction. It was a moment that quietly challenged assumptions they had not realized they carried. And though no one spoke loudly, the understanding spread in small, unspoken ways, in the way people avoided certain glances, in the way posture shifted, in the way silence lingered just a second longer than usual. Across the aisle, the man who had once smirked now stared out the window, his reflection faint against the glass, his expression thoughtful, as if replaying the scene in his mind and recognizing the part he had played in it, however small, while a woman a few rows ahead adjusted her seatbelt slowly, her movements deliberate, her earlier indifference replaced by a quiet awareness that something important had passed through this space. Daniel reached the front of the cabin again, his gaze briefly flickering towards seat 3A before quickly shifting away, not out of avoidance, but out of something more complex, a recognition that he no longer knew how to approach the situation, because the framework he had relied on had already been proven incomplete. He straightened his uniform, a habitual gesture, yet this time it felt less like preparation and more like an attempt to regain equilibrium, to find a sense of control in a moment that had already moved beyond it. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft prepared for takeoff, the soft announcement from the cockpit echoing overhead, routine words delivered in a steady voice. Yet even that familiar sound felt different. Against the backdrop of what had just occurred, because routine had been interrupted, and once interrupted, it does not fully return unchanged. Evelyn remained still, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her expression calm, unaffected, not because the moment had not mattered, but because she had never needed it to unfold any differently. And that quiet certainty, that unshaken composure, became the final contrast to everything that had come before. As the engines grew louder and the plane began its ascent, lifting steadily into the sky, the distance between the ground and the aircraft increased with each passing second, but inside the cabin, the lesson remained close, grounded, unmistakable, carried not through words, but through the memory of a moment when judgment had been made too quickly and respect had been offered too late. At 30,000 feet, the cabin settled into the familiar rhythm of flight, a steady hum of engines blending with the soft clink of glasses and the muted rustle of magazines. Yet beneath that surface calm, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and Daniel Brooks felt it more with each step he took down the aisle. The weight of awareness following him not from authority above, but from the quiet recognition around him. He paused briefly near the galley, his reflection faintly visible in the polished metal surface beside him, and for a moment, he did not look like the man who had confidently taken control of the situation earlier. He looked like someone recalibrating, someone forced to reconsider a judgment that had once felt automatic. The words spoken by the senior official before departure echoed in his mind, not as a threat, but as a certainty. We will review this situation. And that certainty lingered heavier than any immediate consequence, because it meant that what had happened would not be forgotten once the plane landed. It would be examined, understood, and remembered. A flight attendant approached him again, her tone gentle, careful. "Do you need anything?" she asked, and Daniel shook his head slightly, offering a brief, composed response. "No, thank you." Yet even in that exchange, there was a subtle shift, a layer of humility that had not been there before, because the role he had played earlier no longer fit as easily as it once had. Across the cabin, Evelyn Carter remained seated in quiet composure, her attention now on a document resting in her lap, as if the moment had already passed for her, as if she had stepped beyond it without needing to revisit it. And that contrast, between her stillness and the lingering tension around her, only deepened the impact of what had occurred. A passenger seated nearby glanced at her briefly, then looked away, not out of disinterest, but out of respect, a silent acknowledgement that replaced the earlier curiosity, while another passenger adjusted his posture, his movements more restrained now, as though mindful of the unseen lines that had been crossed before. Daniel moved slowly toward the front once more, his steps measured, his gaze no longer scanning for discrepancies, but reflecting inward, and as he reached the bulkhead, he paused again, just long enough to take a quiet breath, the kind that does not reset a situation, but acknowledges it. The aircraft cruised steadily through the sky, the outside world reduced to distant clouds and endless blue. Yet inside, the lesson remained grounded, not spoken aloud, but understood in the spaces between actions, in the restraint of voices, in the absence of assumptions. Evelyn turned a single page of her document, the soft sound barely audible, yet somehow it marked the final transition, from moment to memory, from tension to understanding. And as the cabin lights dimmed slightly for the remainder of the flight, a calm settled in that felt different from before, not just quieter, but clearer, as if something had been revealed that could not be unseen. And though no announcement would ever be made about what had happened, no official explanation given to the passengers who had witnessed it, the impact lingered in a way that did not require words, carried instead in the quiet shift of perspective that followed, in the subtle realization that respect is not granted by appearance, and once denied, it leaves behind an echo that does not fade easily. The aircraft began its gradual descent, the subtle shift in altitude announced by a gentle change in engine tone and a calm voice over the intercom. Yet inside the cabin, the atmosphere carried a quiet clarity that had not been there before, as if the hours spent in the air had given space for something deeper to settle, something unspoken but fully understood. Evelyn Carter closed the document in her lap and placed it neatly into her bag, her movements as composed as they had been from the very beginning, untouched by the tension that had once surrounded her. And as she looked forward, her expression remained steady, not reflective, not burdened, simply present, as though the moment had served its purpose and required nothing more from her. Daniel Brooks stood near the front of the cabin, his posture still professional, his uniform still precise, yet the quiet shift within him was unmistakable, not visible in any dramatic way, but present in the restraint of his movements, in the careful attention to each interaction, as though every gesture now carried meaning he had not fully considered before. When the seatbelt sign illuminated once more, a soft chime echoing through the cabin, passengers began to prepare for landing, their movements calm, routine, yet the subtle awareness remained, threading through the space in ways that could not be undone. A man who had once watched with quiet amusement now fastened his seatbelt without looking around, his earlier expressions replaced by a quiet neutrality, while a woman near the window glanced briefly toward Evelyn before lowering her gaze, not out of avoidance, but out of a quiet respect that had formed without needing acknowledgement. The aircraft touched down smoothly, the tires meeting the runway with a controlled firmness, and as it slowed, the cabin filled with the familiar sounds of arrival. Overhead bins unlocking, seatbelts releasing, voices returning in soft conversation. Yet beneath it all, the memory of what had occurred remained intact, not as tension, but as understanding. Daniel moved through the aisle once more, assisting where needed, his tone measured, his presence attentive, and when he reached seat 3A, he paused, just briefly, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to acknowledge the moment that had defined the flight. And though no apology was spoken aloud, something in that pause carried more weight than words, something quiet, sincere, and fully aware. Evelyn stood when it was her turn to exit, lifting her bag with the same calm precision she had shown throughout. And as she stepped into the aisle, she did not look for recognition, did not seek acknowledgement. She simply moved forward, her presence steady, her path clear, and as she passed Daniel, there was a brief exchange of eye contact, not prolonged, not dramatic, but enough to mark the shift that had taken place. A silent understanding that required nothing more. She stepped off the aircraft into the bright light of the terminal, her figure blending into the flow of travelers moving toward their destinations, her presence once again unremarkable to those who did not know. And yet, for those who had witnessed the moment inside that cabin, she would not be easily forgotten. Behind her, the aircraft emptied, the crew preparing for the next flight, the routine continuing as it always does. Yet something had changed, not in procedure, not in policy, but in perspective, carried quietly by those who had been there, held in the space between assumption and understanding. And as the day moved forward, as schedules resumed and voices returned to their usual rhythms, one truth remained, not announced, not written, but deeply felt. That respect is not something to be measured by appearance or assumed by position. It is something revealed in how we choose to see others, and on that flight, in that quiet moment of recognition, the world, for just a brief time, remembered exactly what that looks like.